right. So we are on week 5, Crisis in the Colonies. Remember that next week your first exam is due at the end of next week, Friday at 11:59 p.m. More details on that later. For now, let's talk about imperial struggle and the war for independence. There we go. All right. For much of the 18th century, the western frontier of British North America was the flashpoint of imperial rivalries. The Ohio Valley became caught up in a complex struggle for power involving the French, British, rival Indian communities, and settlers and land companies pursuing their own interests. Here, by mid-century, resided numerous Indians, including Shawnees and Delawares, who had been pushed out of Pennsylvania by advancing white settlement, Cherokees and Chickasaws from the southern colonies who looked to the region for new hunting grounds, and Iroquois seeking to exert control over the area's fur trade. On this middle ground, a borderland between European empires and Indian sovereignty, villages sprang up where members of numerous tribes lived side by side, along with European traders and the occasional missionary. By the mid-18th century, Indians had learned that direct military confrontation with Europeans meant suicide, and that an alliance with a single European power exposed them to danger from others. The Indians of the Ohio Valley recognized that the imperial rivalry of Britain and France posed both threat and opportunity. As one Delaware spokesman remarked, it was impossible to know where the Indian land lay, for the French claimed all the land on one side of the Ohio River, and the English on the other side. On the other hand, Indians sought with some success to play European empires off one another, and to control the lucrative commerce with whites. In 1750, few white settlers inhabited the Ohio Valley. The area was known more by rumor than by observation, and contemporary maps bore little resemblance to the actual geography. Nonetheless, many colonists dreamed of establishing a new empire in what was then the West. Both the French and English empires were eyeing the Ohio Valley as a place to expand. So I want to open our discussion on the 7 Years' War, known in the colonies as the French and Indian War, with a story about George Washington and his involvement in the war. This is a pretty humorous story, if I do say so myself, and something that you might not have heard before. So the George Washington who served in the militia at this time was not the cautious, experienced man who served during the Revolution. A brash, callous colonel, Washington gained his high military rank thanks to social connections through his brother Lawrence. Almost immediately after his appointment, Washington journeyed westward to build a fort near the Ohio River in order to prevent the French from laying claim to lands the British believed was theirs. The governor selected Washington for this task because of the frontier experience he gained as a surveyor in previous years. Surveyors transformed, quote, savage territories into, quote, civilized lands, fit for European use and improvement. Thus, surveyors acted as agents of British civilization, and Washington's military excursion west served as an armed extension of this project. When Washington approached the Ohio River, he discovered a fort already built by the French, and a small group of 50 French soldiers nearby scouting for native alliances. Instead of waiting and gathering information on the troops, Washington ordered an ambush, which proved disastrous. While it is likely that tensions between Great Britain and France would have erupted in violence eventually, Washington's actions catalyzed the clash, and his ambush of the French resulted in the first skirmish of the French and Indian War. Washington lost 1/3 of his soldiers in the catastrophe, surrendering the rest of his men in an agreement with the French that allowed him to return to Virginia. He arrived home an embarrassed, vanquished commander. Washington returned to battle within a year, and by 1757 he had survived several skirmishes. Despite his luck, Washington still lacked experience and was often criticized for poor and rash judgment as a military leader. However, Washington learned from his experiences during the French and Indian War, and the skills he gained the following years would benefit him greatly during the Revolution. The French and Indian War was the first of the century's imperial wars that began in the colonies and the first to result in a decisive victory for one combatant. It permanently altered the global balance of power. In the 17th century, Britain fought in a series of wars against imperial rivals, after which it emerged as the world's leading empire and the center of banking and trading. To finance these wars, Britain's public expenditures, taxes, and national debt rose enormously. The high rate of taxation inspired discontent at home and would later help to spark the American Revolution. What became a worldwide struggle for imperial domination, which eventually spread to Europe, West Africa, and Asia, began in 1754 with the events I discussed earlier in Britain's attempt to dislodge the French from forts they had constructed. For 2 years, the war went against the British. The tide of the battle turned around 1757, when Secretary of State William Pitt took office and devised a strategy of providing funds to Prussia to fight France and Spain in Europe. Simultaneously, the British struck the French at their weak point, its colonies. In 1759, Britain, with colonial and Indian soldiers playing a major role, had captured pivotal French outposts. As France suffered losses in America, Prussia managed to fend off France, Russia, and Spain in Europe. "As long as the world has stood, there has not been such a war," declared a British emissary to the Delaware Indians. Britain's victory fundamentally reshaped the world balance of power. In the Peace of Paris Treaty in 1763, France ceded Canada to Britain, receiving back in return large sugar islands. As part of the reshuffling of imperial possessions, Spain ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for the return of the Philippines and Cuba, seized by Britain during the war. Spain acquired the vast Louisiana colony from France. France's 200-year-old North American empire had come to an end, and in turn, Britain now owned a much larger part of the continent. This is a map of different battles during the French and Indian War, and also serves as a good map for Pontiac's rebellion. Peace was not lasting for the British and their colonists, as the Peace of Paris was soon followed by open warfare with Native Americans. Throughout eastern North America, the abrupt departure of the French in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War eliminated the balance of power diplomacy that had enabled groups like the Iroquois to maintain a significant degree of autonomy. Remember, just moments ago I was talking about how native groups were able to play colonists off of each other with different European powers. Now that the French are gone, it creates sort of a vacuum and only the British are there. And so native groups lose a lot of their power that they had before. Indians had fought on both sides of the war, although many were allies of the French, which makes sense, right? We've talked about how, a couple weeks ago, I talked about how the French had a much more convivial relationship with the Native Americans as opposed to England, or even Spain for that matter. So it makes sense that more natives would side on the French side of war as opposed to the British. Their primary aim, however, was to maintain their independence from both empires. Indians hoped to preserve the middle ground. Without consulting them, the French had ceded land Indians claimed as their own to British control. The Treaty of Paris left Indians more dependent than ever on the British, and ushered in a period of confusion over land claims, control of the fur trade, and tribal relations in general. To Indians, it was clear that continued expansion of the British colonies posed a dire threat. In 1763, in the wake of the French defeat, Indians of the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes launched a revolt against British rule. Although known as Pontiac's Rebellion after an Ottawa war leader, the rebellion owed at least as much to the teaching of Neolin, a Delaware religious prophet. During a religious vision, Neolin was instructed by the Master of Life that his people must reject European technology, free themselves from commercial ties with whites and dependence on alcohol, clothe themselves in the garb of their ancestors, and drive the British from their territory, although friendly French inhabitants could remain. Nealon combined this message with a new idea of pan-Indian identity. All Indians, he preached, were a single people, and only through cooperation could they regain their lost independence. So pan-Indian identity. So instead of you're Shawnee, I'm Chickasaw, he's Cherokee, we are all Indian. And that is a very valuable tool in gaining strength as a movement. After Ottawa's Hurons and other Indians besieged the major military outpost of Detroit, seized 9 other forts, and killed hundreds of white settlers who had intruded onto Indian lands, British forces launched a counter-attack. Over the next few years, tribes made peace one by one. The uprising inspired the government in London to issue the Proclamation of 1763, which created a line that prohibited further colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So you can see, there's the line right there. These lands were now exclusively for Indians. Moreover, the proclamation banned the sale of Indian lands to private individuals. Henceforth, only colonial governments could arrange such purchases. Okay. British aim was less to protect Indians and more to protect the empire from being dragged into further borderland conflicts. But the proclamation enraged settlers and spectators hoping to take advantage of the lands no longer occupied by the French. They ignored the new policy. George Washington, for example, orders his agents to buy up as much Indian land as possible while keeping the illegal transactions a secret. Failing to offer a viable solution to the question of westward expansion, the Proclamation of 1763 ended up further exacerbating settler-native relations. Like the Indians, colonists emerged from the 7 Years' War with a heightened sense of collective identity. Before the war, the colonies had been largely isolated from one another. Participation in the 7 Years' War created greater bonds among the colonies. But the war also strengthened colonist pride in being members of the British Empire. It has been said that Americans were never more British than in 1763. But soon, the American colonists would come to believe that membership in the empire jeopardized their liberty. When they did, they set out on a road that led to independence. Look at that fancy outfit. Just look at that fancy outfit. When George III assumed the throne of Great Britain in 1760, no one on either side of the Atlantic imagined that within 2 decades, Britain's American colonies would separate from the empire. So how did this happen? Well, after the 7 Years' War, Great Britain was in profound debt, and successive governments in London would seek ways to make the colonies share the cost of the empire. Parliament had passed a series of measures, including the previously discussed Navigation Acts, that restricted manufacturing and trade in the colonies. However, the colonists frequently ignored all of these, and many took part in smuggling. The British government had largely seemed uninterested in internal colonial affairs as well. Salutary neglect, which is basically, we're going to leave you alone and you can do your thing, and minimal requirements on colonial governments had left the colonies largely in charge of themselves. Having seen them as allies during the 7 Years' War, Britain reverted in the mid-1760s to seeing them as subordinates whose main role was to enrich the mother country. During this period, the government in London concerned itself with the colonies in unprecedented ways, which I will talk about in part 2.